Hey guys, Mrs. Karaz here. We're looking at Chapter 4, Section 4, The Spread of New Ideas, a relatively long section, but the last section of this chapter, happily. So, let's dive right in. So we already talked about how the Puritans helped settle our colonies, and one belief the Puritans had was that education was really important, right? And they thought it was important because of its link to religion. If you are educated, if you're literate, that means you can read the Bible, and it's important as a religious, holy person that you do read the Bible in their eyes. So laws in some of the New England colonies required that parents had to teach their children and servants to read. You must. They also required that every town with at least 50 families needed to open an elementary school, and every town with at least 100 families needed to open a higher education school. And we'll look at what that looks like. These were the first public schools, or schools funded by public money. PPAS is a public school, right? Your parents don't pay a tuition for you to come. The money for our school running comes out of their taxes. So one thing that's important to know is that, and I think I'm going to say this in a later slide, at this point, it wasn't mandatory to go to school. You weren't required, right? So these laws said that towns had to have schools open so families and children had the option of attending, but it wasn't required like you're required to be here today until you're 16. So, looking at some differences, and I already started getting into this. So Puritan public schools were funded in part by private money. Some people contributed to the running costs of the school. Some towns saw that there was this law to, establish schools, and they just decided not to do it. They would pay a fine to the government instead of actually starting the school, so not everyone actually had the access to education, even though laws are in place trying to guarantee that. And like I said previously, it wasn't at this time mandatory for all students to attend school. That'll change in the 1800s, and we'll get there eventually. So looking at what life is like in colonial schools. So colonial schools taught religion in school. Obviously, that's very different from what we do here. They taught basic skills like reading, writing, and arithmetic. In the South, often the gentry hired private tutors to teach their children. Remember, we talked about how farms are so far apart, right? So to have a kid walk, if there's 4 miles between the two nearest farms, and we're going to put a schoolhouse in between them, okay, well, each kid's going to walk 2 miles each day to get to school. Doesn't seem likely, right? So it was more likely in the South that the gentry hired private tutors, and children from poor families often didn't receive an education. Looking at gender in schools, so some colonial schools allowed girls all the time, where it would be co-ed schooling. Some only allowed them during the summer session when boys had off. We also have dame schools developing, and those were places where children would go to a woman's house to learn how to read and write. So it's basically like tutoring, but you go to the tutor instead of the tutor coming to you. And that woman might teach multiple children at the same time. Okay, so looking at education for Africans, and I wrote African Americans in all of these slides, but remember that shouldn't really be the term until Africans gain citizenship, which won't happen for a tragically long time. So most schools were restricted to just white children, and in New York, though there are some examples, so we have an Anglican church that ran a school for free Africans, as well as for Native Americans and poor whites. This is one of those times that the textbook tries to sugarcoat things. Trying to get something off my screen. So the textbook gives us this as the shining example, but note that it's an Anglican church. One, singular. There are not many opportunities for free Africans to gain an education, as we could see here. So some religious missionaries taught slaves to read and write while it was legal, but of course when slave codes come around, that's going to change. And after slave codes began, if enslaved Africans wanted to become literate, they had to really secretly teach each other and pass on reading and writing abilities that way, because it was against the law for them to learn how to read and write. It was something that had to be done undercover. All right, so we saw that there were some higher education institutions available. So most students would probably stop after elementary school, but some boys went to grammar schools afterwards, which were like modern high schools. And the first colleges actually began right with the beginning of the colonies, and their main purpose at first was to train men to enter the ministry. So Harvard, for instance, opened in 1693, and it became the first college in the English colonies. We'll see that all of those Ivy League schools really are the oldest institutions in the colonies. So from the very beginnings of American colonial history, we get a distinctive American culture cropping up, in this case in literature. So we have a woman named Anne Bradstreet who published The 10th Muse, Lightly Sprung Up in America. That was in 1650 that she published that. And this expressed the joys and the hardships of life in Puritan New England. We have another poet, Phillis Wheatley, who was an enslaved African in Boston. She published her first poem in the 1760s when she was about 14. So we're seeing that we have some very different voices speaking about what it's like to live here in the colonies and what their experiences were. Mr. Ben Franklin, just taking a look at someone who will play a big role for us moving forward. So Franklin moved from Boston to Philadelphia when he was 17, and he started a newspaper which was called the Pennsylvania Gazette. He also published Poor Richard's Almanac every year, which was a collection of witty sayings that taught moral lessons. It was a different edition every year that he published. He was also a businessman, a community leader, a scientist, and a diplomat. He founded a library and a fire department. He made important discoveries involving electricity, bifocals, and more. So Ben Franklin, overachiever, we're going to see him cropping up a lot in the chapters to come. This is just a primer to who the man is. All right, moving on to two things that will have a big role in the way the colonies evolve and move forward. So we start with the Great Awakening. So this began when religious leaders like Jonathan Edwards noticed a decline in the focus on religion in the colonies, right? People said, hey, like the colony started in large part because people wanted to practice their religion their own way and seek religious freedom. And now we're here, we have the opportunity to do this, and we're deprioritizing religion a bit, right? We're falling into different patterns and caring about other things. So once all these leaders really started bringing attention to this, well, people wanted to change that. They wanted to live by the ideals that they started with. So this led to the rise of many new churches because people felt inspired to practice the specific religion they believed in. Maybe you don't want to be a Catholic, so you can be a Protestant. And maybe you don't want to be a Protestant, so you'll be a separatist, right? There are many different branches of Christianity that are popular here at the time. And this also reinforced the ideas of religious tolerance, and democratic ideals. Because, hey, if I could practice whatever religion I want, maybe you should be able to practice whatever religion you want, and we should all have a say in the actual religious lives that we lead, for lack of a better term. Okay, so second up, we've got the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement that began in Europe. And this seems like it stands in contrast to the Great Awakening, right? Because during the Enlightenment, people looked for ways to solve problems in politics, society, and economics by using human reasoning and logic. It's not that people didn't use logic previously, right? That's the wrong way to think about things. But we saw a reliance on religion a bit more. And you know what? I don't know what to do, so I'm going to pray, and eventually it's going to come to me. And it's not that stopped, right? Religion still played a big role, but people were thinking, trying to think logically for themselves, step by step, and rely a bit on their human brains a bit more. So some ideas that came up during the Enlightenment affected the ideals that we had here in America. And we're going to look at two philosophers that played a very big role, and these are our last two slides, so bear with me. All right, so starting with Mr. John Locke. So John Locke argued that certain natural rights belong to every human beginning the moment they are born, right? These include the right to life, so you have a right to live, liberty, you have a right to be free, and property, you have a right to own your own stuff. He said, these rights cannot be taken away, right? You're born with them, that's it, they're yours, that's it. Locke challenged the idea of divine right, or the idea that rulers get their authority directly from God. And I'm sure you talked about this with Joe and Miss Rosenfeld in 6th grade last year. So John Locke also said, with that challenge of divine right, no one has a direct ability to rule, right? He said that really the people should have a say in who rules, and people should form government to protect their natural rights. That is the sole focus of government, right? It's to protect the natural rights of the people that live within that government. A bold idea. Last but not least, we have Montesquieu, another philosopher. And Montesquieu argued that the powers of the government should be clearly defined and limited, right? The government can't do whatever it wants. It has a certain role, just like Locke said, and we need to make sure that that role is clear. The government should not have total control. Montesquieu favored separation of powers, or the division of the power of the government into separate branches. And in his eyes, that kept any one person from having too much power over the people. He suggested that the best way to break it down was into a legislative branch that makes the laws, an executive branch that enforces the laws, and a judicial branch that makes judgments based on the laws. And if you're looking at this and saying, well, it sounds familiar, it should, because this is exactly what our government, our federal government, is based on today. And we will see how those ideas and ideals influence us moving forward in future chapters. But for right now, we are wrapped up with Chapter 4. Have a great day, guys.